The cameras were rolling live at City College of New York when a former Reagan administration official rose from the audience to challenge the most famous political prisoner in the world. What happened next in that Harlem auditorium would be replayed for decades as one of the most masterful displays of diplomatic brilliance ever captured on television. If this story of grace under pressure moves you, subscribe for more untold moments that reveal what true leadership looks like when the whole world is watching. Drop a comment about a time when someone's calm response to hostility completely changed your perspective. The lights blazed inside Aaron Davis Hall at the City College of New York. Outside, the summer heat hung heavy over Harlem, but inside, the tension was even thicker. This was no ordinary television broadcast. ABC's Nightline, one of the most watched news programs in America, had transformed the auditorium into a live arena for what they called a town meeting with Nelson Mandela. Behind the anchor desk sat Ted Koppel, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm warning. With 43 Emmy Awards to his name and a quarter-century commanding America's premier late-night news program, Koppel was known as the undisputed reigning lion of the tough interview. His direct, unscripted questioning style had made powerful men stammer and seasoned politicians sweat. Tonight, he would meet his match, but Koppel wasn't the only formidable presence in the room. Scattered throughout the audience were carefully selected questioners, many representing powerful American interests. Among them sat Ken Adelman, a figure whose credentials read like a Cold War resume. Former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under Ronald Reagan, former director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, advisor to Reagan during the historic superpower summits with Mikhail Gorbachev. Adelman was a lifelong neoconservative activist, a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, and a champion of the Committee on the Present Danger. In the ideological battles of the Cold War era, men like Adelman had been America's frontline warriors against communist influence worldwide. And now he had been given a microphone and a chance to question Nelson Mandela. Just 4 months and 10 days earlier, on February 11, 1990, the world had watched transfixed as a 71-year-old man walked out of Victor Verster prison in Cape Town, South Africa. His wife, Winnie, stood beside him, and together they raised their fists to the sky as thousands of supporters erupted in jubilation. It was Nelson Mandela's first taste of freedom in 27 years, 7 months, and 7 days. The apartheid regime had arrested him in 1962, convicted him in 1964, and sentenced him to life imprisonment for conspiring to overthrow the state. For 18 of those years, Mandela had endured the brutal conditions of Robben Island, breaking rocks in the limestone quarry under the blazing sun, his eyes damaged by the glare, his lungs weakened by the dust. The authorities had tried everything to break him. They had offered him freedom in exchange for renouncing the armed struggle. He had refused. They had kept him isolated, hoping to make him irrelevant. Instead, he had become the most powerful symbol of resistance on Earth. By the late 1970s, the almost invisible prisoner had transformed into a living legend. The Free Nelson Mandela campaign swept across the globe during the 1980s. Musicians wrote songs about him, students marched in his name, governments imposed sanctions. The man the apartheid government had tried to erase from history had become more famous than any of his captors. When President F.W. de Klerk finally announced Mandela's release, he had tried to control even that moment, planning to fly Mandela to Johannesburg and release him there. But Mandela refused. He insisted on walking out of Victor Verster's gates in the Western Cape that had been his home for nearly 3 decades of imprisonment. Even in the moment of his liberation, Mandela would not be manipulated. The previous day, June 20th, 1990, Nelson and Winnie Mandela had arrived at John F. Kennedy International Airport to a reception unlike anything America had seen. What followed was nothing short of a coronation. 750,000 New Yorkers lined Broadway as Mandela rode through the Canyon of Heroes in a specially built bulletproof vehicle that New York police had nicknamed the Mandela Mobile. The ticker tape parade was an honor usually reserved for returning war heroes, championship sports teams, and astronauts. That night, 100,000 people jammed Harlem's Africa Square to hear Mandela speak from the same podium where Malcolm X had called for his release 2 decades before. The legendary Harry Belafonte introduced him, declaring there had never been a voice more identified with freedom. At Yankee Stadium, 80,000 supporters packed the bleachers. Mandela donned a Yankees cap and broke into the Toi Toi, the South African victory dance. "I am a Yankee," he declared, and the crowd roared. Time magazine titled their next issue, "A Hero in America." But not everyone was celebrating. Despite the euphoria, powerful forces in America viewed Mandela with deep suspicion. The Cold War had not yet ended. The Soviet Union still existed, and throughout his decades of imprisonment, Mandela had maintained alliances that many in the American establishment found deeply troubling. Fidel Castro, Muammar Gaddafi, Yasser Arafat. In 1990, these 3 names represented everything America feared and opposed. Cuba was the communist outpost 90 miles from Florida. Libya was a state sponsor of terrorism. The PLO was considered a terrorist organization responsible for attacks on civilians worldwide. And Nelson Mandela called all 3 of them friends. This was the weapon that conservative forces in America planned to use against him. If they could force Mandela to either denounce these alliances or defend them, they would either strip him of his most powerful supporters or expose him as a hypocrite who talked about human rights while embracing dictators. Inside Aaron Davis Hall, the audience buzzed with anticipation. The Reverend Calvin Butts from the historic Abyssinian Baptist Church was there. Attorney Gloria Toot, a Harlem-born African-American lawyer, waited to ask about South Africa's economic future. Henry Siegman, executive director of the American Jewish Congress, had been positioned to press Mandela on Israel and the Palestinians. The stage was set for a political ambush broadcast to millions of American homes. Mandela entered to a long standing ovation. At 71, he stood tall and dignified, his grey hair and weathered face bearing witness to 27 years of imprisonment. But his eyes were sharp, his bearing regal, and his mind as quick as it had been when he was a young lawyer in Johannesburg. He took his seat, and Ted Koppel began the broadcast. The early questions were manageable. An audience member asked about racial divisions in America. Another questioned whether the United States, given its own troubled history with race, could provide moral leadership against apartheid. Mandela handled each query with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Then, Ted Koppel turned to the microphone across the room and introduced the next questioner. "Let us move on to a next questioner at the microphone over there." Ken Adelman rose to speak. The former Reagan official's tone was polite, but his words carried the precision of a guided missile. "Welcome to America, Mr. Mandela," Adelman began. "Those of us who share your struggle for human rights and against apartheid have been somewhat disappointed by the models of human rights that you have held up since being released from jail." The auditorium fell silent. Adelman continued, his words cutting through the air like ice. "You've met over the past 6 months 3 times with Yasser Arafat, whom you have praised. You have told Gaddafi that you share the view and applaud him on his record of human rights and his drive for freedom and peace around the world. And you have praised Fidel Castro as a leader of human rights and said that Cuba was one of the countries that's head and shoulders above all other countries in human rights, despite the fact that documents at the United Nations and elsewhere show that Cuba is one of the worst." Adelman paused, letting the accusations hang in the air. Then he delivered his final blow. "I was just wondering, are these your models of leaders of human rights? And if so, would you want a Gaddafi or an Arafat or a Castro to be a future president of South Africa?" The trap was sprung. Millions of Americans watched, waiting to see how Mandela would respond to this public humiliation. Would he apologize? Would he distance himself from these controversial figures? Would he become defensive and angry? What happened next would be studied in universities, quoted in diplomatic textbooks, and replayed whenever the world needed a lesson in grace under pressure. Nelson Mandela did not flinch. He did not stammer. He did not apologize. Instead, he fixed Adelman with a steady gaze and delivered a response that dismantled the entire Cold War logic that American foreign policy had been built upon. One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. The audience erupted. People rose to their feet. Applause rolled through Aaron Davis Hall like thunder. But Mandela wasn't finished. As the ovation subsided, he continued, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of 27 years of suffering and struggle. "Our attitude towards any country is determined by the attitude of that country to our struggle." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Adelman's face. "Yasser Arafat, Colonel Gaddafi, Fidel Castro support our struggle to the hilt. There is no reason whatsoever why we should have any hesitation about hailing their commitment to human rights as they are being demanded in South Africa." The audience was transfixed. Here was a man who had spent nearly 3 decades in prison, who had every reason to seek powerful new allies and abandon old ones, who could have easily said what America wanted to hear. Instead, he chose truth over convenience, loyalty over political expediency. They do not support it only in rhetoric. They are placing resources at our disposal for us to win the struggle. That is the position. But Mandela wasn't content merely to defend his allies. In a masterful rhetorical move, he turned the question back on his questioners, exposing the hypocrisy at the heart of American foreign policy. When Koppel suggested that Mandela's statements might offend Cuban Americans as well as Jewish Americans, Mandela responded with devastating logic. "Apparently, Mr. Koppel, you have not listened to my argument. If you had done so, then you had not been serious in examining it. I have replied to one of our friends here that I have refused to be drawn into the differences that exist between various communities inside the USA. You have not commented that I am going to offend anybody by refusing to involve myself in the internal affairs of the USA." Then came the question that left Ted Koppel, one of the most formidable interviewers in American television history, completely stunned. "Why are you so keen that I should involve myself in the internal affairs of Cuba and Libya?" The silence that followed was deafening. Koppel, the man who had made a career of asking tough questions, found himself without an answer. "I expect you to be consistent," Mandela added, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. I don't know if I've paralyzed you." The audience laughed and cheered. Ted Koppel, for perhaps the first time in his distinguished career, was speechless. Later he would reflect. "I think I know better than you, Mr. Koppel," he began, and the largely African-American crowd exploded in laughter and cheers. There were many years, after all, when most of the world's leaders were not lining up to pay tribute to Nelson Mandela. He took his friends where he could find them. What Mandela had done was more than simply defend his allies. He had exposed a fundamental truth about international politics that America had long refused to acknowledge. While the United States had classified the ANC as a terrorist organization, while American corporations had continued to profit from South African apartheid, while Western governments had maintained diplomatic and economic ties with the racist regime in Pretoria, Cuba had been training ANC fighters. Libya had provided resources. The PLO had offered solidarity. These nations, whatever their other failings, had stood with the African National Congress when the West had turned its back. Mandela was not naive about his allies. When pressed about Gaddafi, he revealed a detail that showed the depth of his commitment to principle. In fact, Mr. Gaddafi did not allow our offices in Libya precisely because we had the courage to say to him, "We work with the Jews in our organization," and he didn't allow us to open an office until February this year, when he had to accept us as we are. This was not a man who blindly followed anyone. This was a leader who understood that the struggle for freedom required practical alliances, but who never compromised his fundamental principles. He would accept help from those willing to give it, but he would not change who he was to please anyone, whether they were American conservatives or Libyan strongmen. Later in the broadcast, Mandela articulated the principle that had guided his entire political life. Any man who changes his principles according to whom he is dealing with, that is not a man who can lead a nation. The words hung in the air, a challenge to every politician who had ever abandoned allies for convenience, every leader who had ever compromised principles for power. In a single sentence, Mandela had defined what true leadership meant. It would be for us a grave mistake to consider our attitude towards Yasser Arafat on the basis of the interests of any community, he explained. We are a liberation movement which is fully involved in a struggle to emancipate our people from tyranny. We have no time to be looking into the internal affairs of any country. When Mandela left Aaron Davis Hall that night, he had not only survived the ambush, he had transformed it into a triumph. The confrontation that was meant to diminish him had instead revealed his extraordinary character to millions of Americans. Senator David Boren, who was present at the town hall and would soon vote on sanctions against South Africa, spoke after the exchange. "I think he's going to be very warmly received by people in both parties and by the administration as well. While there may be some differences of opinion on certain issues, like positions on Arafat and Gaddafi, I think the American people understand what has gone on in South Africa. We have seen families divided because they've been classified according to race. We know that people are denied the right to vote because of race." Mandela's 11-day tour of the United States continued. He visited 8 cities, made 26 televised speeches, attended 21 meetings and fundraisers, addressed 5 news conferences, and spoke before a joint session of Congress, becoming the first black private citizen to receive that honor. At every stop, the confrontation at City College was discussed, analyzed, and replayed, and at every stop, Americans came away with a deeper appreciation for the man who would not bend. 4 years later, in 1994, Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. The nation that had imprisoned him now chose him to lead it. The man who had been labeled a terrorist became a global symbol of reconciliation and forgiveness. But those who watched that night at City College never forgot the moment when a 71-year-old man who had spent 27 years in prison faced down the full weight of American Cold War ideology and refused to flinch. Ken Adelman, the Reagan official who had tried to corner Mandela, would go on to become one of the architects of the Iraq War, famously predicting that overthrowing Saddam Hussein would be a cakewalk. History would judge those predictions harshly. But Mandela's words from that night in Harlem continue to resonate. One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. The City College of New York, where Mandela had spoken that night, had honored him with an honorary doctorate in absentia 7 years earlier, while he was still imprisoned. It was a fitting venue for a man who had spent his life fighting for the right of all people to be educated, to be free, and to determine their own destiny. Today, CCNY is home to the Nelson Mandela Project for Social Change, training a new generation of leaders in the principles Mandela embodied: resilience, empathy, and the courage to stand firm in your convictions, even when the whole world is watching. What happened that night in Harlem was more than a television moment. It was a masterclass in moral clarity. Mandela taught the world that true strength isn't about defeating your opponents. It's about maintaining your principles when maintaining them costs you everything. It's about remembering who stood with you in the darkness and refusing to abandon them when the light finally comes. It's about recognizing that your enemies don't get to choose your friends. And perhaps most importantly, it's about understanding that the measure of a leader isn't whether they tell people what they want to hear, but whether they tell them what they need to understand. One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. In a world still divided by ideology, by nationalism, by fear of the other, those words remain as relevant today as they were on that summer night in 1990, when a 71-year-old former prisoner taught America what true courage really means. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold moments that reveal what true character looks like when the whole world is watching. Drop a comment. What's the most powerful example of grace under pressure you've ever witnessed?